Didier, Laroche and I would first like to thank the Institute of Historical Research of the National Hellenic Research Foundation, in particular Sofia Ranieri, the Department of History and Archaeology of the National Capodistrian University of Athens, in particular Sofia Naziri, and the École Française d'Athènes, in particular Laurent Sef, for giving us the opportunity to present the first results of our new research on the Marmaria Terrace in Delphi, which concern the place named Marmaria in modern time, due to the large concentration of marble on a lower level to the southeast of the Sanctuary of Pythian Apollo and the settlement of Delphi. Our presentation will be in two voices, mine live from Athens and Didier's Laroche from Izmir, thanks to the miracle of video conferencing. The communication will take place in two stages. In the first part, I will present the gestation of the program, its place in current research in Delphi, the history of archaeological research on this famous terrace, and the work that we carried out during the 5-year contract of the French school at Athens, 2017-2021, which will be developed in the field during the next 5-year contract, 2022-2026. In the part, Didier Laroche will present some of the results obtained from this first part of the research on the terrace. We could talk for hours about our observations and their consequences for the history of the terrace, the history of Delphi, the history of the Delphic architecture, and not only. We had to make choices. And we hope that the few reflections that we are submitting to you this evening will convince you of the necessity of having restarted the study of the Marmaria Terrace, which hosted the Sanctuary of Athena Pronaia, literally in front of the temple, and the cult of other female deities, but not only, as we will demonstrate. The starting point for this program was a thematic study that Didier Laroche and Jacquemin and I have undertaken on the sacrifices at Delphi. The Sanctuary of Pythian Apollo at Delphi was one of the most frequented sanctuaries of the Greek world because of its oracle. The consultations of the god were accompanied by sacrifices. Solemn festivals took place in a steady rhythm, the most brilliant in the Delphic calendar being naturally that of the Pythia. Any pretext for a sacrifice was welcome. The restitution of the landscape and the ritual and sacrificial topography at Delphi in a diachronic manner from the appearance of the first cults and the Christianization must take into account, as well as the textual sources, the problem of the topographical influence of the ceremonies on a site with a relief that is not very appropriate for large-scale sacrifice. The approach was resolutely multidisciplinary between archaeology, architecture, and history. The new program on the Marmaria Terrace can be seen as both the continuation and last stage of the research program on the sacrifices at Delphi, because the terrace hosted monuments, some of which have been interpreted as temples, and also because of the presence of several built altars to the east of the Temple of Athena, whose function and use are not clear. In the same area, pillar altars dedicated to Athena Erigane, Athena's Stella, Zeus Polyeus, the latter was not found in situ in the sanctuary, but in the surroundings, were discovered, as well as dedications to Elytria and Idia engraved on the facing of the terrace wall that protect the area to the north. But today we will not talk about this area or these very interesting structures. A reminder, the archaeological site of Delphi consists of 6 units: the Sanctuary of Apollo and the Stadium, with the settlement east and west, the Castellan Spring, the Gymnasium, the Marmaria Terrace with the Sanctuary of Athena Pronaia, the funerary ensembles east and west of the settlement, and the city defensive systems west and east. The Sanctuary of Athena Pranaya and the Gymnasium, oriented towards the Pleistos Valley, constitute important fixed points within the Delphic topography, ones of relevance to both the Sanctuary of Apollo and the town, as well as concerning its boundaries and its defensive system in late antiquity. This research is designed to interact with other ongoing programs in Delphi, on the town, the sacrifices in Delphi, the water in Delphi, the stone of the Sanctuary of Delphi, the funerary ensembles, the fortifications in Delphi in late antiquity. Of course, also with the archaic sculpture in Delphi, the sculpture decoration of the Tholos in Delphi, the metal furniture, and so on. The first remains were excavated on the Marmaria Terrace by Edmund Laurent in 1838, shortly after the founding of the new Greek state. These remains are shown in a plan published by Heinrich Niklaus Ulrichs in 1840 in his book Reisen und Forschungen in Griechenland. Some 20 years later, these remains no longer appear on the plan reproduced by Paul-François Foucard in his book Mémoires sur les ruines et l'histoire de Delphes, published in 1865. The terrace was excavated basically at the time of the Grande Fouille, the great excavation in 1801 and 1803, on the responsibility of Théophile Homole. Here we see the first page of the diary of the Grande Fouille that mentions the Marmaria Terrace. The drawing shows the remains as they were visible at the beginning of the excavation. All the monuments we know today were excavated in 1901, as shown by this plan drawn up by the architect of the Great Excavation, Joseph Albert Tournelle. The diary mentioned that most of the exploration was done up to the natural ground level, as we can see from this photography from 1901. I show here other archive photographs from 1901 and 1903. At the top left, an overview from the northeast. At the top right, the Tufa temple of Athena Pronaia. At the bottom left, a view from the north showing the area between the Tholos and the limestone building, with the south of the terrace in the background. Finally, at the bottom right, the two treasuries in the center of the terrace, Doric on the left and Ionic on the right, as seen from the top of the terrace wall north of the monuments. The place on the terrace was only rarely the focus of attention thereafter. After the Greek excavation, the most extensive fieldwork was carried out by Robert de Mongel in the 1920s. The publication resulting from this work, the references I have given on the side, are essential in helping us to understand the topography of the terrace. But his record of the excavations he carried out in the 1920s is poorly documented, whether by drawing, photographies, or text. Jean Bousquet carried out some prospections in the olive groves below in the 1940s. In 1956, Lucien Lorrain resumed excavations on the terrace of the altars to shed new light on Demogel's excavation. In the 70s, Cresson Leroy carried out trials in the Doric treasury. The Ephorate of Antiquities of Photis carried out regularly retaining and terracing works who required small rescues excavations. Subsequently, the Ephorate of Antiquity of Photis has undertaken the management of the site and its enhancement. Several areas surrounding the Marmaria Terrace were expropriated in 2005, and a new site layout was implemented since 2013 and 2015 by the Greek Archaeological Service. The remains uncovered on the terrace have been the subject of several monographs published in the collection Rue de Delphi in the section Topography et Architecture. Some of the findings are published by Paul Didier in a volume devoted to small bronzes, terracotta, and various antiquities in the section Monuments Figurés. In addition, many papers are devoted to the remains and findings discovered on the Marmaria Terrace. Mention should also be made of the pages devoted to the Marmaria Terrace in the Guide of the Archaeological Site of Delphi, published by the French School at Athens, the last edition dating from 2015, as well as a booklet co-edited with the Électricité de France on the occasion of the 115th anniversary of the French School at Athens in 1996, which marked a step in the research on the terrace. These reflections in 1996 made it possible to propose reconstructions of the terrace in the 4th century, rendered here in watercolor by Jean-Claude Delphi and in a virtual three-dimensional form. To conclude the chapter on the research history and bibliography, we should mention the large-scale architectural study carried out by a Japanese mission from the Kumamoto University under the direction of Yuko Ito between 1994 and 1996, whose contributions are undeniable. We are also indebted to Liza Tuki's doctoral thesis on the Analemma walls at Delphi. Our program started in 2017. Laroche and I are the promoters of this program, but in its first phase, from 2017, we worked in a collective with Anne Jacquemin, Delphi expert, and Manon Bibelot, a young architect who is very involved in this project. The data that we present today are the result of the very intense reflections that we have produced in perfect interdisciplinarity. We take the opportunity here to thank the French School of Athens for its unwavering support in our project, its successive directors, Alexandre Farmou and Véronique Chankowski, its UD directors for the Antiquity and Byzantium section, Amélie Perrier and Morgan Serre, as well as Lionel Fadin and the Archive Services, and the persons of Marie Stahl, Calliope Christophe, and Elvira Kelly for their fruitful collaboration. We also warmly thank the Euphoria of Antiquities of Photis, its director Athanasia Psalti, the deputy director Nicholas Petrakilos, as well as all the collaborators of the Archaeological Service in Delphi. Likewise, we warmly thank also the guardians of the site and the museum in Delphi, who showed extreme patience with us. The resumption of the study of the Marmaria Terrace brings a more global perspective into play, one to do with the developments at a Panhellenic sanctuary, the Sanctuary of Pythian Apollo, and on the outskirts of the city, administrating or co-administrating the Sanctuary of Apollo according to the period of its history. Research has now far concentrated on the identification of the buildings of the Marmaria Terrace. Now, there is no overall agreement. Since the first plan published by Heinrich Niklaus Ulrichs in 1840, which presented the first remains excavated at the Marmaria Terrace by Edmund Laurent in 1838 until now, the identification of the monuments found in the terrace has been constantly debated, and there is no chance of solving this question today. In fact, from the beginning of research, it has always been the aim to fit the remains to the description of Pausanias and not to study them in their own spatial and functional environment. Since Pausanias speaks of 4 nowell and parts of 6 main buildings have been found, there are therefore at least 30 possible combinations to be considered in making any identification. Thus, until now, studies have focused on the monuments and particularly on one area on the terrace, the one that contains the monuments here in blue color. Attention was also brought, but not enough, to the area immediately to the east of the Temple of Athena, here in pink color, which contains several very interesting altars. As for the vast area to the east and symmetrically to the west side, both here in gray color, it has still been very sparsely explored. The preliminary step in our field program consisted of a photogrammetric survey of the Marmaria Terrace and its surroundings with a drone in 2017. The production of these documents was necessary to implement the overall field study. First, in order to calibrate on the ground all the plans and surveys carried out since the first excavation. Secondly, to organize a global architectural study which consisted of course referencing the published studies with the scattered blocks remaining on the archaeological sites. The inventory of the architectural blocks preserved in situ on the Marmaria Terrace required 4 one-month field campaigns from 2018 to 2021. 11 architectural block deposits, A to A, were determined. The corpus of blocks on the Marmaria Terrace within the terminus reached the number of 1834 blocks. At the end of our inventory, we are able to find each of the blocks preserved on the terrace and to know the situation of the blocks by monument. Here we can see in green the blocks from the so-called Temple calcaire, in blue from the Telos, in pink from the Ionic trestle, in purple from the Doric trestle, in red from the Athena temple, finally in gray from unknown monuments. This is where I give the floor to Didier Laroche, who will present some of the results obtained from this third part of the research on the terrace.
A lot has been said and studied about the Marmaria Terrace. So when we started this work 5 years ago, I think we didn't had in mind that we could find so many interesting things, and that there was so much to do still on this terrace. So we could speak hours and hours about each building and the problem of Marmaria. So we have to make a choice. And here you see the 6 buildings which were mentioned by Sandrine. And I will speak, of course, about some topics only, especially 3 buildings that you see on this map on the left and on the right. That is to say, the 2 first buildings on the left and the one on the right. These buildings, they used to have a name previously, but as our study goes on, their name becomes more and more problematic. So we have the bad habit now to mention the buildings by the number, because we think we make less mistake when we speak of 43 or 42. So we are going to speak about this building. And next slide. First, one of the oldest of the terrace, which is called the Temple of Apollo of Athena, Pronaia, or the temple in Tuf, that means in limestone, sandstone. As you have seen before, this building has been found in good condition during the excavations in 1901, but it suffered immediately from rocks falling from the mountain. But here, when the building was found just at the time of the excavation, we are lucky because we have some drawings which were made and some photographs which can help us to understand the previous organization of the temple, because before it was smashed by the rocks. And as you see, it's a very strange organization, because you see on the drawings quite in a good condition temple, but a big part of the temple, I would say 95% of the temple, has go down on the slope, on the natural slope, and it was done by an accident, of course, which happens a lot in Delphi. Apart from falling of rocks, you have a lot of sliding of land, and the building had went about 3 meters lower in the direction of the valley. But what is most surprising, that the building was still standing. Just one part, 4 columns of the rear facade stood in place, in their original place, and the rest of the building went 3 meters down, but without serious damage. What you will see on the next slide is a detail that you see now on the small photograph, which is also very surprising. It's the quality of the reparation which happened at the time to consolidate, to maintain the columns. And it's a kind of retaining wall that you see here on the screen, and which is made very in detail to fit with the fluting of the columns. It's so it means, for this reason, we think that this accident and the repair happened in ancient times, in classical times, or maybe at the beginning of the Hellenistic times, but not on the later period. Here, this temple was made exactly at the same time as the main temple in the Sanctuary of Apollo, the temple which is called the Temple of the Alcmeonids, because it was this family who built it in the years 510, 500. And just at the same time, the Temple of Athena was built. Next slide. On this image, you see the again spectacular view of the temple, because before it was smashed, because it was crushed under rocks. There were 15 columns more or less standing still on the Silobat. And at the right, you see the interesting comparison of these two temples, which are completely contemporary and which share a lot of common features, not only for architecture, but also for sculpture. The two buildings were adorned with a lot of sculpture, acroteria, and of course, in the front and the rear facade, some sculpture that you can see both in the Museum of Delphi. When you compare the two buildings, you see the plan is very similar. It could be maybe the same architect who did the two construction. And you see there is a ratio that you can find when we measure any kind of measurement in one of the two buildings. You find the same ratio of 3 and 5. For the 3 for the small temple of Athena and 5 for the big temple of Apollo. Next slide. In this temple and in another building that I won't speak about this evening, which is one of the two treasuries, so-called treasuries, which are next to the temple, has been found a very ancient material, Doric pieces from columns, shafts, and capitals from Doric buildings. Unfortunately, when the first publication was done, Mr. de Mangel took all the parts of these buildings together to try to restore the ancient building it came from. And so he came to the conclusion of a very strange building with a very thin columns, which made a lot of problems because of the history and the evolution of the Doric columns. So more recently, Mr. Schwanner, Ernst Ludwig Schwanner, a German scholar, understood that there was a mixing of different materials from different buildings, and then he restored quite normal archaic buildings from maybe from the first half of the 6th century BC that you see on the right side below. And this building was one of the buildings from which these pieces came from. And it shows that when they erected these two different buildings, they wanted to show the continuity of the cult and of the sacred buildings by re-employing these pieces as a terrace in front of the two buildings. So it's interesting from the point of view of the continuity of the cult. Next slide. Okay, here you see again now after the disaster of 1905, what happened. Some rocks fall on the building, and this is a problem also for us. Not that we fear that the rocks will fall again on us, but it can fall at any moment on this place. And the geologists, the specialists of geology, say that it's one of the worst places in Delphi to build, and they had this problem during all the antiquity to build retaining walls everywhere, or artificial terrace, in order to avoid the falling blocks to come on this point. And maybe you remember that during two wars, the first with the Persians and the second war with the Galatians, the enemy was supposed, the ancient historians told us that the enemies were stopped by the falling rocks, which the gods sent to them just at this moment to avoid the sanctuary to be robbed from these people. So we see again, we were seeing again these rocks until a few years ago, and now there are some which has remained, but most of them have been removed from the place. Next slide. Now we are going to move to the western part of the sanctuary, and we are going to look at these buildings, which the biggest one was called for a long time the second temple of Athena, because it was supposed that after the damage caused to the first building, the temple of Athena was moved and placed at the other end of the terrace. When the 4 last years we worked on this building, we found very many reasons to be doubtful about this theory and to think that this building is not a temple of Athena, and even more that this building is not a temple at all. When you see this plan, you see that the 4 buildings, you don't see, but I tell you that the 4 buildings on the right are completely adorned with a sculpture. They are the most decorated buildings of the whole Delphi, maybe with the treasury of the Scythians. And the one on the west is completely lacking any kind of decoration. So it's a first indication that it has not the same status, and it would be very odd for a temple not to have any kind of sculpture. But we have also other reasons for that. Next slide. Here you see on this slide, on the left, you see the old restoration drawing proposal from the publication of 1977 from Jean-Pierre Michaud and Jean Blécon. They made a very hard work, big work, and they came to this solution with an unhabitual, strange building with a very big cellar on 11 meters wide span among the cella, and a pronaos with 6 columns on the facade. And when they made the publication, they thought that the crepidoma around was going all around the building, and they also proposed to have a very big opening with 3 open bays in the crossing wall, the pronaos, we could say the crossing wall rather, of the building, which also is something with which is very unusual for the temple. And when we started to work on the about 500 blocks that remained from this building, the total amount of blocks was around 1,000 at the beginning, so we have about half, or about half of the blocks which still exist. And we got a lot of new information that this was not in the previous publication of 77. And among some information are very significant, some are less. I will, of course, speak of the most important information, new information about this building. The most important is the fact that these 3 bays, in fact, was not like it was proposed, but it was a crossing wall with a door, not 3 doors, but just 1 door in the middle, and a system with windows on the upper side. And we have a lot of archaeological evidence for this. This is not just a hypothesis. It's confirmed by the drawings and the relevés that we made. And so we started to ask ourselves if we were in front really of the temple, because it became very strange, and it reminded us a lot the architecture of Macedonia. And so we also looked at the technique of the building, and then we understood that all the technical features of the building were dating from the second half of the 4th century and not the first half that it had been said before. And so it could be, so it was possible to be a Macedonian. And when we compared to other buildings, we found that this building was rather belonging to a kind of building which are meeting place and not temples. And for many reasons that I have no time, of course, to explain now this evening, but we are going to publish this in a very I hope quick way. And so we had in mind that there was one of the most famous building in Delphi who has not been found yet. It was the Synedrion, the place where the members of the Amphictyony used to meet. So we found that it could fit very well with this hypothesis. Next slide. Here you see all the details for explaining this different proposal for the crossing wall. And maybe next slide, just to get a little. Here you see a restored plan of the building, which shows that you have a perfect amount of place for the 24 members and the 48 secretaries of the Amphictyonic League. And when you ask yourself, but why they made a building for the Synedrion for the Amphictyony at this time, at the half of the 4th century, you immediately remember that it was a time that Philip, king of Macedonia, came like as a triumphator, after his victory over the Phocidians, and for this reason he was given two personal place, not as a king but as a person in the Amphictyonic League, and he restored the Pythian Games in 346 BC. And this is a very good reason, that it was a long time that the archaeologists in Delphi were looking for any kind of monuments or any reminder of this important time, not only for Delphi, but the whole Greece, because it was just the time that Macedonia put his hand on the whole continent. So if you are right, and we think, of course, that we have a lot of arguments in favor of this hypothesis, we see also that the building which is next to this previous temple of Athena and Synedrion was identified for 30 years ago by American archaeologist Nancy Boukidis, who had studied the architecture of the Estiatorion, especially in Peracora, and who said that the building was by many chance was also a Estatorion, which the presence of a Estatorion just next to the Synedrion is very logical. And another point which is very important, the only thing that we knew about Synedrion was the fact that from not inside the Synedrion, but near the Synedrion, you could see the Corinthian Gulf, Kira, and the valley, which was occupied by the Phocidians, because it's said in the ancient literature. And if you go there and you look, it's in fact the only place in the whole sanctuary where you can see the Corinthian Gulf to see from above, and then it's also another argument. Next slide. Here is an example of a meeting place in another sanctuary, which is in Anatolia, called La Branda, which is excavated by one of our colleagues in Lyon. And you also have the meeting place, and next to the meeting place, you have also what they call andron, but it's a kind of estatoria, a place, a meeting place for the people to have to eat and to rest after the meeting. So this is a quite logical arrangement of buildings. Next. For the Macedonian roots of this architecture and the relationship with some features of the Macedonian, when you see in Aegae, the palace, the entrance, but also in other buildings, not only in Aegae, you see, for instance, this kind of pilasters, the half columns associated with pilasters, which is a very common in this kind of architecture you find in the whole Macedonian world, and also after in Asia, in Anatolia, after in the Hellenistic period. And this you find in Delphi only in this building. Next slide. Yes, you also have in Lefkadia, you saw the arrangement with the door in the center and in the columns at the windows at the upper part, and you have exactly the same at another, I would also say, Macedonian buildings. It's the oikos of Attalos first in Delphi, where you have the facade, which looks like this one, also with one door and 3 windows on the upper part of the facade. Next. Now we are going to speak very little about the most famous building of this terrace, the Tholos here. And for many times, a lot of archaeologists had noticed that the Tholos was associated with, had something to do with the building next, the building we just talked about. And so our examination came also to the Tholos, and we came to the same conclusion that the Tholos was from the same period, that is to say earlier than what was said before, around 350, 340. And one of the reasons here is very important. It's the proportion of the columns, which is completely anachronic with the time. The building was supposed to date from 375 around, and at that time there was not such a ratio for the Doric columns. So many scholars had noticed this before, and they said we don't understand why there is this unfair surprising ratio. Now it's not surprising because we adopted the dating from about 350 or 40, and we had some next slide. When we proposed this, we feared a little bit the reaction of our colleague who works on the sculpture of the Tholos, because we thought maybe he would say no, it's impossible to change the date of the building, and we were very pleasured when he said that. He said why not, and maybe if he's here is listening to us, maybe he will say something about that after. But he said that there was no problem, and there could be interesting links between the iconographic representation of the Tholos and the fact that it would be also from the Macedonians. So we came to the very evident solution, which some people before us had thought before, but nobody dared to say this because of the dating. It is the fact that the Tholos, in fact, is the exact correspondent of the Philippeon in Olympia. That is to say, the building devoted to the cult of the royal dynasty of the Argead, of the Macedonians. And but there is so much to be said about this that we, of course, this evening we just want to give the information, and we hope we'll have reaction, and we will give some further information about the installation inside the building, where there was also, like in Olympia, the sculptures of increasingly Fontine sculptures of the royal family. Next slide. because I see that the time is going on. We came to the end, maybe, so it's so maybe I hope we have time to have a discussion after this, but I think that Sandrine will conclude about this speech of tonight and give some information about the further direction of our work in the years to come.
Yes, I think that you can see that the revision of the structures in place and of the straight blocks confirms the interest of revisiting the Marmaria Terrace, the interpretation of which had changed only marginally since the publications of the 20s. You know, the importance of linking the question raised by each of the buildings, which the traditional mode of publication had not allowed to do. Only Robert de Mongel had attempted to take an exhaustive and historical look, and it requires further archaeological investigations. The fact that we now have a comprehensive documentation of the architectural material on the entire site of Marmaria is an advantage that our predecessor had lacked. And now we will begin second step of our research program for the years 2022 to 26, under the auspices of the French School at Athens and the research center of ALMA and the University of Lille. And you can see here many people who are involved in this new program. And we thank you for your attention, and we would be delighted, of course, to discuss with you how the thoughts that we share with you today. Thank you very much.